Were medieval people flat earthers? You might be sleeping in the same room as your pigs and your cows and some sheep. If the bishop's not in town, the party is on. Who uses paper to wipe their backside with perfectly good moss on a tree? Things change. Hello, I'm Matt Lewis, and today I'm looking at Google questions about medieval lifestyles. I've brought my friend Joe with me, who I was last seen mangling slightly. I think he's forgiven me. He's decided to come and listen along to these questions too. So, we good, Joe? Good? Right, let's dive in. Okay, so first question. Did medieval children go to school, and what were they learning? For the most part, no. If you were rich enough to be able to afford to send your children to school, they might go to a grammar school, which would normally be attached to a cathedral or something like that. There they would learn grammar, to read and to write, maybe a bit of law, a bit of rhetoric, public speaking, all of those kinds of things. Or you could go to a monastic school if you were looking for a career in the church. So that would train you much more focused on what you would need to be a priest in later life, some Latin, lots of religious training too. But for most people, they couldn't afford to go to school, and they were probably too busy preparing for a life of work that would come around very, very quickly. So Joe is probably not going to school because Joe is a little peasant boy and he needs to get in the fields and do a bit of work. Were there medieval universities? Yes, there were. There absolutely were. So the first one appears in Bologna in the late 11th century. A few years after that, we get the University of Oxford as the second European university and the first one in England, and that's followed a few years later again by Paris. The University of Cambridge comes along about a century or so after Oxford as a result of a bit of a spat with the teaching staff at Oxford, who go off and set up their own university at Cambridge instead. And medieval universities were funny places, you know, much like today, they attract a certain age of young man. It was men going to university. And so you get lots of tension sometimes between the people of the town and the people of the university who are coming in, drinking lots, causing lots of trouble. And this is particularly true in Oxford, where there is a really strong town and gown rivalry that spilled over into a massacre in the 14th century. There was riots for several days. Lots of townspeople were killed. Some students were killed too. And if I remember rightly, the argument was over the quality of the beer in the pub. The students thought it had been watered down a bit too much and was too expensive. And the town was blamed for causing all of this trouble and forced to parade, the mayor and the people of the town was forced to parade through Oxford to apologise to the students for the deaths that they'd caused. And this went on until the 19th century. And the next question is, how old were people when they started working? Very young, I guess. From our point of view, children would be working around the family farms and things like that as soon as they were able. There were no limits on the age at which you could put children to work. If they weren't going to school, then they needed to be doing something. Everybody had to earn their keep. The secondary question on here, was there an apprenticeship? Apprentices did exist in the medieval period, and it was a way that you could get your child into a trade. So they might not be able to afford to go to school or to go to university, but they could do an apprenticeship, and they would start this any age from about 12, somewhere in their teens, they could start an apprenticeship. And you would normally do 7 years. It varied slightly by industries, but you would normally do 7 years working for a master. So if you wanted to be a tailor, you would go and work with a master tailor for 7 years, and he would teach you, his job was to teach you everything that he knew, so that at the end of that 7 years, you were able to set up on your own as a tailor. In the meantime, you're probably living with your employer. He might be giving you a little bit of money, but really you're getting paid in your room and board and the education that you're getting. And it's an investment for a future career as a master tailor when you could hopefully be as rich as that guy is. The next question we have is, what was the weather like in the medieval period? The same as today. It was weather. It was sunny sometimes. It rained a lot in England. Not much really changes. We do have a few cycles of weather throughout the period. So we get what's known as the medieval warm period. And there was one of these during the thriving of the Roman Empire too. And at times when the climate gently warms, we can see the circumstances suiting human expansion. So crops will grow really, really well, and populations can thrive, and there can be a lot of expansion. So we see that in around the high medieval period, so say the 11th century to about the 13th century maybe. But then after that we get the beginning of what's known as the Little Ice Age. And this comes in around about the 13th century sometime, and it lasts until the 19th century, maybe the middle of the 19th century. And that cooling of the climate during that period meant that it was several degrees colder, which meant that crops didn't grow so well. So we see a depression in the growth of populations and all of that kind of thing as well. Where did people sleep, and is it true about the second sleep? They slept in beds when they could, but it depends what your house is. So if you're living in a one-room farm building, you would probably be sleeping in the same place as you're living and cooking and all of those kinds of things. Lots of these buildings had a central hearth, a central fireplace around which you would want to gather if it was winter and it was cold. There are stories of people bringing farm animals in at night when it's particularly bad weather. So you might be sleeping in the same room as your pigs and your cows and some sheep, which might not be the most pleasant thing you've ever had to do. The second sleep is a real thing. So people would go to bed for a period, then they would get up and then they would go back to bed again for their second sleep. This was part of just the cycle of things. They would get up for a few hours and try and achieve some things, do some work, and split their sleep periods into two. So I guess maybe there's a remnant of that in something like the Spanish siesta that might still happen today. This idea that you can sleep more than once a day, that you can power nap a little bit, and that you can break up this long period of sleep that most of us have now during the hours of darkness. So the second sleep was a real thing. And next question, what type of hairstyles were popular in the medieval era? Most people, I don't think, particularly cared too much about the state of their hair. Married women would most often have their hair tied up and would wear something to cover their head. If you wore your hair down and uncovered, it was generally a sign that you were unmarried and available. So married women would want to avoid that particular appearance. We have examples in the late medieval period of high status women for whom the fashion was to pluck their hairline. So the classic example of this is the portrait of Elizabeth Woodville, who was the Queen of Edward IV. And if you look at that portrait, she has a really high hairline, and that's because it's been plucked right the way back, almost as far as mine. And the idea was to give the woman a moon-shaped face, and this was considered immensely attractive. Elizabeth Woodville was considered one of the most attractive women in England during this period. For high status men, we see times in which the military haircut was really popular. So again, in the 15th century, during the wars with France, lots of people are displaying their military prowess, and they will do this quite often through the hairstyles. So think of Henry V and the portrait that we have of him with this really bowl haircut. And this was just the military style. That was the equivalent, I guess, of the modern American Army's buzz cut. It was what soldiers had to identify them as military men. And the next question we have is, did medieval people have toilet paper, and how did they wipe their... Yeah, I won't say the rest of that. Medieval people in Europe didn't really have toilet paper. For most people in the medieval period, that idea of using a stick with perhaps some moss on it or some leaves or something like that was a way to wipe your backside. If you could afford it, so higher status people might use strips of cloth. If you could afford to waste cloth in that kind of way. Midden heaps, so ancient rubbish heaps that have turned up from the medieval period, contain these strips of cloth that have obviously been used for that purpose. Toilet paper was being used by the end of what we consider the medieval period in somewhere like China. So they did have toilet paper made of rice paper, and there are accounts of people from the Near East and the West getting to China and finding that they're using paper to wipe their backsides and being completely bemused and disgusted by this terrible practice. Who uses paper to wipe their backside with perfectly good moss on a tree? Things change. Next question is, did medieval people wear underwear? Well, men would wear something that would look like shorts to us today underneath their hose. Hose were like tights, really. Women would wear something like a kirtle, so an underskirt, but they wouldn't wear knickers, underwear under that. There have been some examples found of what look like medieval bras in that there are separate cups to them. Fashion before that was to wear breast bands, so you would tape it up in long lines of cloth, and the idea there was actually to flatten the chest rather than to accentuate it or show it off. Our next question is, what type of music did people listen to? I mean, you'd listen to whatever was going, really. There were travelling musicians around, and they might play instruments like a guitar, which is like a small guitar, things like that. There were a variety of instruments, a flute, anything like that that could be used to make a bit of music. And they might turn up in the taverns and things if they think they can get a good amount of money out of a crowd. And it's hard to know exactly what songs or music they might have been playing because it's really poorly recorded. So this is travelling people perhaps making up tunes, perhaps reciting some old favourites and things like that, but they weren't writing down music. The examples that we have of music that are written down really are religious, liturgical music from the churches. What was the average height of an adult in the medieval period? It's slightly hard to say, and it varies a little bit through the medieval period, but based on skeletal evidence that's been discovered, people seem to be around about a mean height of 5'5", 5'6", something like that. It moves up and down an inch, depending again on things like the climate. So the medieval warm period, people are eating better, they will grow to a slightly taller height. Come the Little Ice Age, food is slightly harder to come by, their diet is a bit more restricted, and they might lose an inch or two in height. But I think if we think around about 5'5", 5'6", as an average height, that would be about right. And I mean, that was still the average height, the mean height for people into the middle of the 20th century. I think it's only fairly recently, I think that started to creep up a little bit. Did medieval people brush their teeth? They did, and I know this because I've tried it fairly recently in a video we did on medieval dentistry. You can go and take a look at that for some of the specifics and to watch me trying not to spit out some medieval dentifrice. So these were powders that were put together, and the idea was that you would dip a cloth in the powder and you would rub that on your teeth and gums. And this could, if you couldn't afford much more, it could be salt. It could be a bit of salt and pepper. But if you could afford it, you could start adding a bit of spice, some frankincense, things that might also freshen your breath as well as remove the stain and the scale from your teeth. So people were aware of a need for dental hygiene. It wasn't the most affordable thing for a lot of people. How did medieval people hear about news? Gossip? I mean, down the pub, whatever the medieval equivalent of social media would be, people just spreading news around the place. You would get official proclamations. So if something nationally important happened and the government wanted you to know, the king wanted you to know something specific, there might be a royal proclamation that would be sent out into the towns and cities and read out for everybody to hear. But there weren't really things like newspapers. Before the printing press, it was just too inefficient to print anything that was going to be passed around the community. It would have had to have been handwritten, probably by a monk or a clerk, either in a monastery or later in a writing shop. Next question, during the Middle Ages, which country was the best to live in? Oof, I mean, maybe none of them, maybe all of them, any of them. It depends if there's a war at the time, probably. Medieval countries go through these huge cycles of having wars and peace and wars and peace. It's difficult to say. There was probably not really a region of Europe that was out of this cycle of peace and violence. So I don't know that I know a best country to live in, a peaceful one during the medieval warm period. It's probably as far as I can go. Did medieval people go on holiday? Not holiday as we would recognise it, I don't think. So the closest you would get to a holiday in the medieval period might be if you decided to go on a pilgrimage. So that's a good religious reason to go on what might look an awful lot like a holiday. It might be a pilgrimage to the next town, to a specific shrine in a church there. You could plan a longer pilgrimage. That was a reason to go on what might look like a holiday. You're not working, but there is a religious point, a spiritual benefit to making that journey. And it wasn't necessarily meant to be easy either. And we have lots of examples then of people collecting pilgrim tokens. So if you go and visit the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, you would try to purchase a little pilgrim token to kind of prove that you've been there. And I imagine lots of neighbours being like your friends when they get back off holiday and they want to show you all of their photos from their fabulous beach holiday. I imagine you'd be invited round to your neighbour's house and they'd set out all of their pilgrim tokens and say, oh, this is from I went to Lincoln Cathedral. Let me tell you all about Lincoln. No. What were the existing religions in the Middle Ages? So there are the obvious ones, I guess, particularly if we're being very Eurocentric. We will talk about Christianity, we'll talk about Islam, we'll talk about Judaism. So they are the three that really impact on the story of the Near East and Europe. But there are plenty of other religions. There are some that will be familiar to us today. So Hinduism is around during the medieval period. Sikhism begins in the middle of the 15th century. So that's a really emerging religion towards the end of the medieval period. And there are still things like Zoroastrianism, a really old religion that still lingered in the medieval period. It hadn't quite been driven into non-existence by the press of Islam and Christianity in particular in that region. So there were lots of religions around. Throughout the medieval period, there are also lots of pagan religions. So the Vikings, perhaps the most famous version of a pagan religion with all of the Norse gods. But for a time, the Anglo-Saxons were pagan before they were re-Christianized. I don't know all of the world religions, but obviously across Africa and the North American continent, there will have been religions in play too, that we don't necessarily talk about from a Eurocentric point of view when we focus on Christianity and Islam and Judaism in particular. So next question, how diverse was medieval England? England was probably more diverse than you think it was, but it's hard to really get a handle on it. We do have skeletal remains of people who seem to have originated from Africa. So Ethiopia in particular is a Christian nation and considered an ally of Christian Europe. So there's reason to believe that Ethiopians in particular may be travelling across Europe and to reach England. Other African nations may have been keen on trade with parts of Europe too. One of the most interesting things that I've come across is at Bamborough Castle. There is a place sort of in the sand dunes next to Bamborough Castle known as the Bole Hole. And archaeologists found a set of Anglo-Saxon remains there that date from kind of the 7th, 8th, 9th century, around about that period when Northumberland was still an independent kingdom. And those skeletons show a really diverse population that originated from around Europe. So the idea there is that Bamborough is a real trade hub, that people are coming from all over the place to deal with Bamborough. Some of those people are either settling or at least dying while they're there too. And next we've got, how did medieval people tell the time? They didn't really, and they didn't need to. They needed to know when the sun came up and when the sun went down, and you tell the time because it gets light and then it gets dark. You wake up and go out into the fields and you will work for 13, 14 hours a day. In the winter, your days are much shorter. So this is before the time of artificial lighting. There's no kind of gas lights. There's no electricity, obviously. You would tend to go to bed when it gets dark. And in the winter, that can mean going to bed at 6, 7 o'clock in the evening because can't see to do anything. That said, in churches and monasteries, it was slightly different. So the days of monks were fixed around the hours of the day. So these points throughout the day at which they were required to pray. They would get up at matins in the morning, and then they would have every few hours through the day a call to prayer that would end at bedtime. They would get up in the middle of the night again. So again, this idea of a second sleep, they would break their sleep in the night to get up and pray as part of their routine too. So they had much more need to know particularly what time it was to understand where they were in the cycle of their daily prayers. And that's why you quite often see mechanical clocks being attached to cathedrals and churches and things like that. Those were the communities that needed to know specifically what time it was. Next question, what did the average day look like for a peasant, a priest, or a king? I think for a peasant, every day would seem quite monotonous. You are working to the cycles of the seasons, so you're planting your crops, you're tending your crops, you're reaping your crops, and then you're trying to store everything and make it last for the winter so you can prepare for the next spring. As I've said, your days would be long and they would be hard work in the summer. Peasants working in the summer would have to take on something like 8,000 or 9,000 calories a day just to fuel the amount of work that they were doing. The day for a priest would be structured very much around those points of prayer. It might depend what order you were in. So some of the orders believed that you should engage with the communities around you and you should teach communities. Some of them were much more insular and they believed that you should spend time in your cell, so a single person room, on contemplation and in silence. Many of them also would be spending time between prayer, writing manuscripts. So priests were the great producers of books and manuscripts throughout the medieval period. The day for a king, I think we have this impression that medieval kings kind of lazed around and did nothing. And I don't think that's true at all. So your day would start nice and early, you would rise, you would hear mass. But almost from the moment that you get up, you will be engaging in business. You will be presented with petitioners who want things from you. You will be asked to make decisions about all kinds of things. And so when we hear about kings going out and indulging in the hunt and things like that, I think there's a danger in it assuming that that's what they did with all of their time, rather than that's what they did whenever they got a spare moment to get themselves away from the administrative grind of the work that was involved. And next question, how likely were you to die of the plague? The statistics around this are slightly debated and the numbers can be really hard to pin down. As a rough guide, it's been suggested that where the plague hit, it killed between a third and a half of the population that existed there. So across Europe, this could run into millions and millions and millions of people. The population depression caused by the Black Death doesn't recover for centuries afterwards. You probably have a 50-50 chance of dying if the plague hits an area where you're living. Next question, what was the plague cycle? Once you catch it, you would begin to feel what we would consider flu-like symptoms. So you'll feel tired, achy, bit of brain fog, things like that. But then you would start coming out in these buboes, the swellings that the bubonic plague takes its name from. And once the buboes come up, I think this was seen as a sign that you probably had a day to live, maybe no more than that. They talk frequently in the Chronicles about people waking up fine in the morning and not making it to bed that night because they contracted the plague and died so quickly from it. How likely were women to die in childbirth during the Middle Ages? Unfortunately, quite likely. Again, I think we don't have really good statistics around numbers to put it to, but childbirth was an incredibly dangerous moment for any medieval woman. And it's only fairly recently that it's become less of a dangerous moment for women. In many ways, it's considered a great leveler. So as many noble women are probably dying in childbirth as common women too. Being wealthy is no protection against this kind of thing. Noble women might be able to get access to relics. So you could have the girdle of St. Mary, which you could place across your stomach, and it was believed to be something that would bring you good luck and health during childbirth and help you to survive it. And the fact that women felt the need to rely on that shows how dangerous it was considered to be, and that you are literally putting your life on the line in order to bring another life into the world. Did people use money in the Middle Ages, and what was it worth? In England in particular, the only unit of currency was a silver penny. So the only coin that you would ever encounter was a piece of silver worth 1 penny. Money is structured into pounds, shillings and pence. So you will quite often see this represented in medieval material as a pound sign that we would recognise today. So £1 followed by, say, 5s, 5 shillings, and then 5 pence would be 5d. So the D is used for pence because it references the Roman denarii, so their name for a penny or a coin. 1 penny is worth 1 penny, a shilling is worth 20 pennies, and then a pound is worth 12 shillings, so a pound is worth 240 pennies. A normal labourer in the field might earn 1 or 2 pennies a day. A skilled craftsman might earn 5, 6, 7 pence a day. Your average earl might have an income of about £600. So we can see that huge gap between the wealthy and the poor. So next question, what was the average lifespan? Quite hard to pin down, unfortunately. Our idea of medieval lifespans is skewed by the high infant mortality rate. But what we see is if you make it to adulthood, you have every chance of making it to be 60, 70 years old. There's no reason why you wouldn't. It's difficult with more common people because, again, we don't really have the records of their births and deaths and their lives. Next question, was there a judicial system in the Middle Ages? There definitely was. We know there is capital punishment, for example. So you commit numerous crimes, from treason to murder, to theft would get you hung. But in the wider community, there are circuits of judges. So we have what are called the heirs of judges, and the king will send them out on circuits. So they're movable courts, and essentially they will tour regions and shires, and they'll visit towns. And when the court comes to town, that's your chance to make a legal case. If you believe someone owes you money or someone has taken a piece of land that's yours, you would go to the justice of the heir and you would present your case to him and hope that you can get a hearing in the courts. But access to that could be quite sporadic. And there was also a really interesting system of local justice and responsibility too. There were hundreds, so these were gatherings of 100 pieces of land, 100 families kind of thing. And quite often for example, if there was a murder within a community, that 100 families would be tasked with finding the perpetrator. It wasn't considered the state's job to go and find them, it was the role of the community. If they found the person, they could hand them over to face justice. If they didn't find them, the community would be presented with a fine that they would have to pay to the Crown for failing to discharge their duties. And there are also manorial courts for the lords, so those lords that have lots of pieces of land with people living on them, those people could go to the manorial court of their lord to try to get justice, and equally their lord might take them through the manorial courts if he believed they owed them money in rent or service or anything like that at all. So there were lots of quite disjointed systems of justice and courts at work in England. Next question, how did medieval people entertain themselves? It depends how much daylight you've got at the end of work. You know, work is hard in the medieval period. Having said that, there are long periods at Easter and Christmas where people aren't necessarily expected to work. So particularly Christmas, it's the middle of winter, there isn't much work to do around farms. You could probably expect 2 weeks of parties. We also know that people indulged in sport. So football was around in the medieval period. We have lots of references to people kicking balls around all over the place and various games that will evolve into something like football. Next question, how did people share stories in the Middle Ages? A lot of it, again, will be word of mouth. Biblical stories is an interesting one because we would expect to see lots of those images in churches painted onto the wall. But people would consume religious stories in this way. This was a medium that people understood. They knew how to read images and paintings because they didn't necessarily know how to read words. What they could do was interpret those kinds of things. And that's why lots of medieval portraiture, you will see lots of symbols and messages hidden throughout it. And we do have examples of travelling storytellers. There was fairly recently some documents discovered that was essentially like a script of a stand-up comedy act from the medieval period in England. And there's clearly a sense that these people were touring local communities, putting on shows anywhere that they felt they could make money. And that perhaps they're tailoring some of their material like you would see a stand-up comedian do today. So they will come to a village, they'll find out who the hated local rival village is, and they'll make jokes about them all night. And then they'll go to that hated village and make jokes about the other one all night. So there is lots of that going on, but again, the difficulty is that that material is very, very rarely written down. That new discovery a little while ago is really unique in giving us a window into medieval humour. Next question, were medieval people flat earthers? Absolutely not. Medieval people often talk about the globe, and you don't hear medieval stories of falling off the side of the world and all of those kinds of things simply don't exist. Yes, we have maps like the Mappa Mundi, a big flat idea of how the world is laid out, with Jerusalem at its centre as the kind of spiritual and geographical heart of the world. But we also do have globes. People in the medieval period knew the world was round. Next question, did medieval monks party? If the bishop's not in town, the party is on. Monks like to definitely portray themselves as living this very serious, very austere life in the service of God. Medieval monasteries make and consume obscene amounts of wine. If that's not a party, I don't know what it is. Monasteries become incredibly wealthy. They can afford these kinds of lifestyles. They don't want the public, the outside world necessarily to know, but I suspect some monks were living a party lifestyle in their monasteries. Maybe not all of them, but definitely some. And that was the last question. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my attempts to answer some of those questions on medieval lifestyles. Have I got them right? Have I got them wrong? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please do subscribe to History Hits YouTube channel for more of the greatest content in history.